Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into semiconductor geopolitics, CoCom 2.0. Picture this, a room full of allies after the Second World War, quietly agreeing on a list of things you simply cannot ship to your rival, because the wrong valve, the wrong magnet, or the wrong computer could tilt the balance of power. That was the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, better known as CoCom. Not a treaty, not a court, an understanding. And for nearly half a century, it shaped who could build what, and how fast. Today, as you hear terms like export controls and dual-use technologies, the echoes are unmistakable. So the question hanging over our heads is simple but explosive. Are we rebuilding CoCom in new clothes? And if so, what did the first version get right? What did it break? And why did it end? Let's set the stage with the precedent, because the past is the operating manual for the present. CoCom was born around 1949, at the dawn of the Cold War. The aim sounded modest: coordinate among the United States, Western Europe, and a handful of allies to stop advanced technology, industrial machinery, and strategic materials from flowing to the Soviet bloc. In practice, modest turned into massive. Think of it as a shared do-not-export list, updated and debated behind closed doors, where members had to align on what counted as sensitive. Was a high-precision ball bearing civilian or military? What about a computer with a specific instruction set? The devil was in the details, and those details turned into policy. Here's the first key insight. CoCom was less of a law and more of a system. It ran on consensus, and consensus created both strength and friction. Strength, because a coalition can cover many ports, many factories, many customs offices. Friction, because every item on that list had a lobby, a factory floor, a local politician arguing for an exception. If you've ever tried to coordinate a group project where one person wants speed, another wants perfection, and a third wants credit, you already understand CoCom's political economy. Second insight. The technology was dual-use long before the term became fashionable. A milling machine might make airplane parts or kitchen mixers. A sensor could end up in a hospital or a missile. So controls had to be broad enough to matter, yet fine-grained enough not to choke ordinary life. That tension produced a constant cycle of revisions. Raise the bar, industry finds a way around. Tighten definitions, engineers redesign to fit beneath the threshold. That cat-and-mouse dynamic will sound familiar in our later slides, but for now, recognize that it begins here. Third insight. CoCom's end is as instructive as its beginning. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed, the bipolar world dissolved, and the logic of the list shifted. The West no longer faced a monolithic adversary with a tightly sealed economy. Instead, markets globalized, supply chains lengthened, and private companies became the principal engines of technology diffusion. In 1994, CoCom was disbanded and replaced by the Wassenaar Arrangement, a broader, more transparent framework for conventional arms and dual-use goods. Same concern about sensitive tech, different world, different tools. The idea was to move from secretive club rules toward published control lists and national discretion with shared guidance. Here's where the continuity gets interesting. Even after CoCom, leverage still pulled around chokepoints. That word matters. A chokepoint is a place in a system where a small number of firms or countries control a critical capability. Back then, it might have been specific machine tools or high-end computers. The lesson was simple, though not easy. If you control the narrow neck of the hourglass, you can shape the flow of sand. But you also inherit responsibility. Squeeze too hard and you incentivize replication elsewhere. Squeeze too softly and you don't change behavior at all. Calibrate poorly and you get both outcomes at once. Now ask yourself the uncomfortable question. Why do coalitions build these control regimes in the first place? The answer is not paranoia. It's incentives. Rival states face strong motives to acquire technologies that compound power. You cannot invent physics, and you cannot uninvent the transistor. So coalitions try to slow, channel, or raise the cost of diffusion. Whether they succeed, and at what price to civilian prosperity, depends on the clarity of the goal, the precision of the list, and the honesty of enforcement. Records from the period show that when controls aligned with true bottlenecks, they bit. When they sprawled into broad, ill-defined categories, they turned into paperwork that creative traders learned to dance around. There is also a moral layer here that is easy to miss. Controls are justified by security, and security matters. But controls also rearrange the lives of individuals who never set foot in a defense ministry. A researcher who cannot import a measuring instrument. A factory that loses access to a replacement part. An entrepreneur who relocates to a different jurisdiction because the rules add months to a product cycle. CoCom's history contains all of these stories. You are not asked to pick a side yet. Just notice that power travels through systems that look dry on paper but feel very human in practice. Finally, why does this precedent matter right now? Because our current debates are not new, they are upgraded. The basic architecture is the same. Coalition coordination. Lists for dual-use items. Friction between national security aims and civilian spillovers. But we live in a world where private firms stitch together global supply chains, where tooling is concentrated in a few hands, and where scientific knowledge spreads at digital speed. That means the leverage is sharper, the stakes are higher, and the feedback loops are faster. So as we step off this first slide, keep 3 framing questions in your mind. 1. Where do true choke points exist, and who controls them? 2. How do rules change incentives for engineers, managers, and traders at the ground level? 3. When a control succeeds on paper, how do we measure its real-world effects over time, not just in the first press release? With those questions, the Cold War precedent becomes a guide rather than a relic, and it sets us up to examine how this playbook is being rewritten in our own moment. Let's get clear on what actually changed, because headlines love drama, but engineers and policy folks live in the details. In October 2022, the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security rolled out a 3-layer control stack aimed at advanced computing and the tools that make it. Layer 1 set performance-based thresholds for certain chips. Not the brand names, not the marketing claims, but measurable compute characteristics that determine whether a part is likely to accelerate cutting-edge AI or high-end modeling. If a device crossed those ceilings, shipping it to China typically required a license with a very high bar for approval. Layer 2 targeted end use. If a system met the definition of a supercomputer, or if the chips were destined to be aggregated into that kind of system, the rules kicked in regardless of the individual chip's model number. It was a recognition that capability often emerges in clusters, not just in the single component. Layer 3 reached into the factory itself, listing key categories of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, subsystems, and the associated parts and software. The message was simple, even if execution isn't. If a tool can materially enable advanced production, it fits under the umbrella. 2 additional moves in that first package changed incentives overnight. First, a set of restrictions on certain activities by U.S. persons when it comes to supporting advanced chip production in China. That meant many American engineers, field service technicians, and managers had to stop doing what had been routine without specific authorization. Second, a tailored expansion of foreign direct product and de minimis rules. In plain English, chips whose development or manufacture depends on specified U.S. technology can fall under U.S. jurisdiction even when produced abroad. If you're a global firm, that instantly reshapes your compliance map. Now, what happens the moment you draw a line? People try to stand just beneath it. In the months that followed, companies explored chip variants tuned to sit below the threshold while preserving as much useful performance as possible. Perfectly rational behavior. The rules, in turn, evolved. In October 2023, BIS tightened definitions, adding new metrics to reduce the gap between on-paper capability and in-practice aggregated performance. Think of it like moving from measuring just top speed to also measuring acceleration and payload. By capturing interconnect bandwidth and other scaling relevant attributes, the update made it harder to build systems that technically complied but functionally delivered what the controls intended to restrain. Clarifications also arrived for tool categories, software, and the kinds of support activities that require a license. The net effect? Less wiggle room, more specificity. By December 2, 2024, a further strengthening landed. Additional entities were listed. Certain gray areas around advanced packaging, memory closely coupled to accelerators, and components that enable performance leaps so clearer guardrails. Compliance timelines mattered here. Firms were given a short runway to adjust contracts, pull service personnel where needed, and reroute shipments. If you manage operations, you felt this not as a headline but as a calendar alert, a procurement backlog, and a training session for your compliance team. Pause and think about the economic mechanics at work. Performance thresholds turn into design constraints. End-use definitions reshape how data centers are architected and how clusters are described on paper. Tool controls show up as longer lead times, more layers in the spare parts chain, and a premium on service contracts that clear the licensing bar. And those U.S. person restrictions, they do not just remove headcount. They remove tacit knowledge, the kind of troubleshooting you do at 2 in the morning when a vacuum seal fails or a recipe drifts by a fraction. You cannot download that expertise from a website. Is this about punishment? No. It is about probability. Policymakers are trying to change the odds that advanced capability spreads at the same speed everywhere. Even small slowdowns at the top of the curve compound over time. But there is also a cost. Compliance is a real expenditure. Redesign takes time. Some civilian projects will be delayed or rerouted even if they never touch a weapons program. Whether that trade is worth it is not a question for this slide to answer. Our task here is to understand the machinery of the rules as they were written and updated in 2022, 2023, and late 2024, and to notice how those layers interact. One last point. The structure of these rules signals their theory of control. Don't try to micromanage every commodity part. Instead, identify the narrow necks where compute power concentrates, where manufacturing capability scales, and where specialized human know-how is decisive. Then, focus policy right there. If that theory is right, the rules bite. If it's wrong, the system routes around them. Either way, we can now see the logic clearly on the page. If you want to understand power in a supply chain, do not start with the total number of factories. Start with the number of firms that can do the one thing nobody else can. In chips, those one things are unusually concentrated. A handful of Japanese companies make key deposition and etch tools. A single Dutch company makes the machines that bend light into patterns small enough to draw modern circuits. A few American firms design the software that turns physics into manufacturable layouts. That is why Allied policy alignment matters. When the narrow necks of the hourglass are held by friends, coordination can change the flow of the entire system. First, Japan. In 2023, Tokyo's Trade Ministry moved to license 23 categories of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Notice the choice of instrument. Not a blanket ban, a licensing regime. That matters because it allows calibration. If a tool materially enables advanced logic production beyond certain thresholds, the default is control. If it is older or clearly aimed at legacy nodes, there is room to approve. For a toolmaker, that transforms your sales funnel. You now need technical dossiers, end-user attestations, and sometimes on-site verification. For a buyer, it means lead times stretch and configurations may be adjusted to sit on the license side of the line. Same hardware family, different capability, different paperwork. Incentives quietly update themselves. Now, the Netherlands. Here the choke point is unusually visible. The most advanced lithography systems come from one place. That gives Dutch policy outsized importance relative to the country's physical size. When export licenses are tightened or service permissions are narrowed, the effect is felt in far-away cleanrooms. And it is not just the initial sale. These machines live long lives through maintenance, spare parts, software keys, and field service updates. A license that affects servicing can be as decisive as a license that affects shipping a new tool. If you cannot keep uptime high, your fab's economics tilt in the wrong direction. If you cannot receive a critical module or a software patch, yield management becomes a guessing game. Controls aimed at those support channels are therefore not cosmetic. They are levers. Coalition alignment is not automatic. Each ally weighs its own firms, jobs, and strategic interests. That is why you see policies that look similar but not identical. Japan defines categories one way, the Netherlands implements license conditions another way, Washington refines its thresholds on a slightly different calendar. But the direction of travel is coordinated enough that attempts to arbitrage one jurisdiction against another face a shrinking corridor. If you are planning a multi-year capacity roadmap, you suddenly care about the policy diaries of 3 governments, not just your own capex budget. Let's talk incentives on the ground. For tool vendors in allied countries, the upside of alignment is clarity. When rules are synchronized across the major choke points, your compliance team spends less energy guessing and more time executing. The downside is commercial. Some deals simply do not clear, even if they were profitable. For buyers in restricted markets, the incentive shifts toward acquiring older gear, stockpiling spare parts, or developing domestic substitutes. For third-country intermediaries, the temptation is to act as a conduit. That is where aligned enforcement and follow-up on end-use certifications matter. If one ally treats end-use declarations as a living document and another treats them as a filing form, the system leaks. There is also a technical nuance here that is easy to miss. Not all tools are equal in their bottleneck power. A metrology system that allows you to measure features at the limits of physics can be as important as the lithography tool that prints them, because without accurate measurement you cannot ramp yield. An etcher that enables high aspect ratio structures can unlock a memory architecture even if the lithography remains unchanged. When allies coordinate across these complementary categories, the controls interact like gears rather than isolated brakes. Miss a gear, and the machine still turns. Catch the full mesh, and the motion slows. From a systems perspective, think of this as a network of switches. Each switch controls a high leverage capability. Japan flips one for certain deposition or cleaning tools. The Netherlands flips another for lithography and service. The United States flips a third for design software and specialized components. The effect is multiplicative, not merely additive, because advanced manufacturing requires several of these switches to be on at the same time. Turn off any one, and the path narrows. Turn off two, and the path becomes a tightrope. There is a moral and strategic tension embedded in this alignment. On the one hand, it is meant to reduce the probability that sensitive capabilities scale rapidly in ways that threaten stability. On the other hand, it conditions civilian access to general-purpose technology on the decisions of a few governments and a few firms. A researcher who needs a service visit, a startup that needs a license to import a component, a factory technician waiting for a software key. Their work now sits downstream of geopolitical coordination. That is not an argument for or against. It is a recognition that choke points are powerful precisely because they touch real people doing detailed work. So when you hear the phrase allies and choke points, translate it into this practical question. Can a small number of coordinated decisions shape the global diffusion of advanced manufacturing capacity? The historical record from other sectors says yes. The open question is how clean the alignment can stay under commercial pressure and how fast the targeted actors can reroute around the narrowing path. Those dynamics will shape the next chapters in this story, but on this slide the takeaway is straightforward. Alignment among allies matters, because the most decisive nodes in this system are not spread evenly. They are clustered, and clusters respond to coordinated policy. If you want to see the narrowest neck of the hourglass, stand between light and logic. On one side is physics, on the other is a working chip. In the middle live two extraordinary bottlenecks. The machine that writes the pattern, and the software that decides what the pattern must be so it can actually survive the journey from design file to silicon. That is extreme ultraviolet lithography and electronic design automation. Let's start with the light. Extreme ultraviolet lithography does something almost rude to intuition. It takes light at a wavelength so short that ordinary lenses do not work, then bounces it off a series of mirrors polished so precisely that a dust mote would look like a mountain, and uses that to carve features measured in nanometers. Think about what that means operationally. The source power must be high enough to keep throughput acceptable, the optics must stay impossibly clean, the wafer must be positioned with sub-nanometer accuracy, and the mask has to encode patterns that will not distort under that brutal optical regime. Miss on any one of those and your yield collapses. This is not a commodity printer. It is a physics experiment that has been industrialized. Now add the reality that there is one company shipping EUV scanners. Not one country. One company. That concentration creates leverage, but it also creates fragility. A new installation is not just a capital purchase. It is a commitment to a service relationship, a spare parts ecosystem, and a schedule of upgrades that keep the tool at peak performance. That includes software keys, modules that change overlay accuracy, and incremental improvements like better dose control or pellicle handling. Even more, the next step up the staircase, high numerical aperture EUV, tightens the tolerances again to push resolution and pattern fidelity. That pushes costs and learning requirements higher, and it raises the premium on fabs that can absorb complexity without losing their minds. Now pivot to the other bottleneck. Design is not simply drawing shapes on a canvas. At advanced nodes, you are designing with the manufacturing process in mind from the first keystroke. That is what electronic design automation does. It is the collection of tools that translate human intent into transistor-level layouts that obey a forest of rules. Spacing rules, density rules, double patterning rules, fin orientation rules, and then the lithography-aware transformations that pre-distort shapes to counteract what the optical system will do to them. This is called optical proximity correction and its more advanced cousins, and it is one of the quiet miracles that turns a theoretical circuit into a real one. A few firms dominate EDA. That creates a different kind of choke point. Instead of one machine on a loading dock, you have software licenses, support contracts, and version stacks embedded across thousands of engineers' workflows. Try to rip that out and you do not just lose a program. You lose a shared language for how time enclosure is achieved, how verification is done, how power integrity is modeled. That tacit layer is why EDA concentration matters. A design team does not retool in a quarter. They migrate over years, because every block of intellectual property, every training script, every build system is tuned to a specific toolchain. There is an important complementarity to notice. EUV and EDA are not separate silos. They feed each other. As EUV pushes feature sizes and patterning tricks, EDA must encode more constraints and smarter rule checking so the layout will print and yield. As EDA invents new placement and routing strategies or machine learning-assisted optimization, EUV benefits because the input patterns become friendlier to the physics the scanner must deliver. This feedback loop is the essence of the hourglass. The narrower it gets, the more valuable coordination between design and manufacturing becomes, and the harder it is for a latecomer to catch up without access to both sides at once. Economically, this has three consequences. First, the fixed cost mountain grows. A modern fab pays for scanners, metrology, cleanroom infrastructure, and a lot of human know-how just to stand still. Add high numerical aperture EUV, and the step height increases again. Second, learning curves compound advantage. The more wafers you run, the more edge cases you encounter, the better your recipes and your failure playbooks become. That silently widens the gap with every quarter. Third, service and update control turns into policy leverage. If licenses, spare modules, or critical software updates require approvals, that becomes a practical throttle on capability growth. You feel it as a yield plateau that refuses to budge until a technician arrives with a suitcase and a software dongle. There is also a human story here. EUV scanners are installed and kept alive by teams who know how to interpret the machine's quirks. EDA tools are supported by application engineers who have seen 100-time enclosure crises and know which obscure switch in the flow gets you home before dawn. This tacit knowledge is part of the bottleneck. It is not in the brochure, but it is in the outcome. When you hear the phrase structural bottleneck, translate it into a very practical image. A short list of firms. A shorter list of people. And a playbook that barely fits on paper because most of it lives in experience. So, when we talk about EUV and EDA as the neck of the hourglass, we are not being poetic. We are describing a system in which a small number of machines and a small number of code bases condition what is physically buildable at the frontier. If those are accessible, the river runs. If they are not, the river pools and seeks a different valley. Either way, this is where the flow is decided. Draw a bright line on a spec sheet and you instantly create a game. Not a moral game. A math game. The moment a performance threshold becomes the definition of controlled, engineers begin designing to the test. That does not mean they defeat the purpose. It means they explore every legal inch beneath the ceiling to keep useful capability while staying on the compliant side of the line. If you have ever seen a car tuned to pass an emissions test under a specific cycle, you know the genre. In chips, that showed up as variants adjusted for bandwidth, interconnect, or total compute density so the model number changed less than the metrics did. Think about how that plays out inside a design team. You have a target envelope. Peak compute has to sit below X, interconnect bandwidth has to sit below Y, memory capacity or coupling must avoid a definition that tips you into the controlled category. So you start pulling levers. Lower lane counts on a link. Reduce clocks. Trim the number of active cores, or fuse off certain paths so the datasheet reads safely. You might add firmware governors that cap performance unless an authorized update flips a key. None of this is mysterious. It is precisely how rational actors respond when rules are written as thresholds rather than as broad functional bands. Policymakers, of course, saw this coming. That is why the next update tightened the rulebook. Instead of measuring just one headline number, the definitions expanded to capture system-level behavior. Interconnect bandwidth began to matter because clusters move mountains of data and can act like one large brain even if each chip is modest on paper. Effective performance became a blend of compute and movement, not just a single ceiling. That shift is like going from measuring the top speed of a vehicle to measuring its lap time around a real track with turns and elevation. Harder to game, closer to real capability. Now widen the lens beyond design. The supply chain learns the game too. If a destination is heavily restricted for frontier gear, buyers begin snapping up older parts that are not on the list, then stacking them in volume, or they redirect purchases through third countries and intermediaries that look innocuous until you trace the paths on a map. End-use certificates proliferate. Some are robust and audited. Others are paperwork with a stamp. distributors suddenly find themselves as reputational gatekeepers, because serial numbers and batch histories tell stories when they are read carefully. A healthy system treats those documents as living artifacts, checks them again months later, and compares declared use with field observations. A lax system files them away and never looks back. There is also the service channel, which rarely gets headline attention but often decides outcomes. If a market cannot buy the latest accelerator, it may try to buy service contracts, spares, or firmware for what it already owns. That matters because a small module, a calibration file, or a field engineer's visit can unlock significant real-world performance. When rules extend to those touch points, the gray areas shrink. When they do not, you get a shadow market in expertise where what is bought and sold is not just metal, but know-how. Let's talk economics for a moment. Threshold rules create a price wedge. A fully controlled device carries licensing uncertainty, delay, and sometimes prohibitive risk. A near-threshold device carries less of that burden. So the near-threshold device can command a premium relative to its raw performance because it comes with lower paperwork friction. Meanwhile, legacy gear that is definitely outside the controls can see a second life. Prices on yesterday's parts rise because the value of certainty rises. Markets are not making a political statement here. They are pricing time, risk, and substitution. Workarounds are not only technical or logistical, they are also architectural. If it gets harder to import a cutting-edge chip, you might change your software to rely on sparsity, lower precision math, or more efficient model architectures so that less raw compute delivers acceptable results. You might shift workloads to where electricity and cooling are cheaper because the total cost of performance now includes compliance overhead. You might invest in packaging techniques that help memory and compute talk more efficiently even if the core silicon is not top tier. Each of these is an incentive-driven adaptation. None of them require breaking rules. All of them change the slope of progress in subtle ways. There is a moral lesson hiding in the spreadsheets. People root around obstacles. Engineers by redesign. Operators by reconfiguration. Traders by searching for new channels. The question is not whether they try. It is how the rules shape the paths they pick. If the thresholds are clear and genuinely tied to the capabilities that raise security concerns, the workarounds tend to steer toward benign substitution. If the thresholds are crude or lag reality, the workarounds push into gray zones that later require harsher corrections. That cycle is what we are watching: threshold, workaround, tightening, new threshold, and so on. So on this slide, hold two ideas at once. First, incentive-compatible rules matter because they change design and purchasing decisions before anyone thinks about evasion. Second, as long as thresholds exist, actors will ride the edge. The art of policy in this domain is to define the edge so well that riding it keeps the world safer, not more brittle. Whether the current definitions achieve that is not something we will judge here. But we can see the gears turning, because they turn in public, in product sheets and procurement logs, and they always have. When rules change, strategy changes. China's responses have unfolded along two tracks that run in parallel. Policy moves to apply pressure, and technology pushes to close gaps. You can think of them as the diplomatic lever and the engineering lever, often pulled at the same time. Start with the policy lever. A notable example was the decision to restrict the use of certain foreign memory products in parts of China's critical information infrastructure. That sent a message with multiple audiences. To domestic buyers, it nudged procurement away from a foreign supplier toward local alternatives. To foreign firms, it signaled that access could be conditioned on the broader climate of controls. And to negotiators, it created a bargaining chip. Whether or not any single restriction bites hard, the mere possibility of targeted pushback reshapes expectations. Companies begin to ask not only can we ship, but will our customer be allowed to use what we ship 12 months from now? Now the engineering lever. The headline here is the effort to advance logic production using deep ultraviolet lithography with multiple patterning. In plain terms, if you cannot get the latest extreme ultraviolet tools, you try to squeeze more out of the one you already have. Deep ultraviolet is older, but not obsolete. With clever process integration and a lot of masks and etch steps, you can print features far smaller than the raw wavelength might suggest. That is what we saw with the demonstration of 7nm class silicon made without EUV. Technically impressive, historically resonant. It shows that constraints can be bent, even if they are not fully broken. But drilling into the physics and the factory floor reveals the trade-offs. Multiple patterning is like building a cathedral out of matchsticks. It can be done, but every added step compounds chances for error. Overlay must be perfect across many passes. Edge profiles must remain consistent through repeated cycles. Line edge roughness accumulates, and every extra mask adds direct cost. That does not just affect whether something is possible, it affects whether it is economical at scale. Yields may start low, ramp takes time, and the talent that keeps recipes stable becomes a key limiter. A path exists, but it is narrow and expensive. This is where service and support return to the center of the story. A foundry that chooses the DUV heavy route must keep its tool fleet performing at the limits of specification, which is far easier with regular maintenance, spare modules, and high-touch vendor support. Controls that make routine servicing harder change the slope of progress even if the core tools are present on the floor. A fractionally lower uptime or a slightly slower recovery from excursions can turn a theoretical node into a practical headache. The technology push is not only about the core transistor. It is also about the system around it. When frontier logic is hard to scale, attention shifts toward packaging, memory integration, and software optimizations that extract more performance from available silicon. We have seen signals of this in products that pair compute with tightly coupled memory and in devices marketed as proof points that domestic capabilities can reach modern thresholds. The message to the domestic audience is motivational. The message to the outside world is strategic. Progress continues, even under constraint. At the same time, policy and engineering moves reinforce each other. Restrictions on a foreign supplier's products make room for local firms to win design slots, even if their first iterations are rough. Domestic pushes to demonstrate advanced nodes, even if costly, create political space to claim momentum and attract capital. Neither move magically erases choke points, but together they can keep programs alive and learning curves moving while longer-term substitution efforts mature. There is a human dimension worth stating plainly. Engineers are being asked to do very hard things with toolkits that are missing some pieces. Managers are being asked to hit production targets while the service ecosystem is under strain. Policymakers are being asked to balance messaging with market realities. Those pressures can produce shortcuts, but they also produce ingenuity. The question isn't whether progress is possible. It is at what cost, at what yield, and over what time frame. Constraints do not stop ambition. They shape it. So the counter moves on this slide teach a simple lesson. When the path through the front door narrows, actors scout the side doors. Policy creates space. Engineering tries to make that space livable. The result is not a binary of success or failure. It is a spectrum of workarounds that buy time, create negotiating leverage, and sometimes unlock a genuine, if more expensive, technical path. Whether that path is sustainable is a question for later slides. Here, we simply note that the game did not stop. Its rules changed, and the players adjusted. When governments decide to spend big on a strategic industry, they don't just write checks. They write conditions. Guardrails. Think of them as the lanes painted on a very expensive highway. You can drive fast, but not anywhere you want. In the semiconductor world, those guardrails tell companies, if you accept public money or tax credits to build capacity at home, you limit what you can expand abroad in certain places and at certain levels of technology. Not forever. Not everywhere. But in ways that try to keep the new horsepower pointed in the right direction. Let's make that concrete. Imagine you are a chipmaker planning a new facility inside the United States. You apply for grants or loans, and you expect to claim a sizable tax credit on your capital investment. In return, you agree to a set of commitments. 1. Don't materially expand advanced capacity in countries of concern for a defined number of years. 2. Don't transfer certain technologies in ways that effectively recreate the same frontier capability outside the intended ecosystem. 3. Be prepared for clawbacks if you decide to test those limits. A clawback means a portion of the public support can be revoked or repaid if the conditions are breached. It's not symbolic. It's enforceable. The phrase materially expand is the hinge. What counts as material? In practice, it's defined with thresholds and examples. Adding a few legacy tools to maintain support for older products is not the same as installing new production lines capable of advanced logic or memory beyond the agreed node. Upgrades for safety or maintenance are not the same as capability jumps that change your competitive position. If a company crosses that line abroad after accepting domestic incentives, the guardrail says, you risk losing some of those incentives. The rule doesn't aim to freeze the world. It aims to prevent subsidies from unintentionally underwriting capacity where policy prefers restraint. Now, step inside the boardroom where these policies meet spreadsheets. Every expansion plan gets a decision tree. If we accept support, what exactly are we allowed to build overseas? Which nodes? Which volumes? Which timelines? If we decline support, can we still finance domestic capacity at the scale and speed we want? Does the tax credit move the needle enough to justify the restrictions? What about joint ventures or foundry service for a customer that wants a certain product in a restricted geography? All of that becomes part of the capital allocation debate. The guardrails are not a footnote. They shape where billions flow. Guardrails also shift the value of time. Because conditions often apply for a set period, firms think in windows. What can we do in the next 5 to 10 years without tripping a clause? Do we stage our advanced investments at home first, then revisit foreign plans after the restriction sunsets? Do we reserve our most sophisticated packaging or memory integration capacity for the domestic site where the incentive is anchored, while keeping older lines abroad? In other words, the rules do not just say yes or no. They reorder when and where the yes happens. There is a talent and knowledge dimension here too. Guardrails tend to intersect with restrictions on technology transfer and certain kinds of technical assistance. That means the most sensitive process recipes, yield improvement techniques, and design enablement support may be walled off to stay aligned with the commitments. Companies respond by building thicker internal firewalls. Who gets to work on what? Which teams can access which process of record? Which service agreements include which on-site support? This is not only about shipping tools. It's about who shows up to turn the knobs and what they are allowed to say when they get there. Economically, guardrails create a new kind of arbitrage to eliminate. Without them, a firm might accept subsidies in one country while quietly scaling the crown jewel somewhere else, using the home site as a signaling device and the offshore site as the profit engine. With them, that split model becomes costlier. Not impossible, but riskier, because clawback triggers convert a hidden geographic hedge into a potential financial penalty. That pushes firms toward clearer commitments. If you take the help, prioritize domestic frontier capability for the duration. If you want full geographic flexibility now, fund it without the guardrails. It forces a choice. There is also a fairness question that is not philosophical, it is operational. Companies that play by the rules need confidence that rivals are not gaming them. That puts pressure on monitoring and reporting. How do you verify that a foreign site isn't quietly ramping a restricted node? How do you confirm that an equipment upgrade is maintenance rather than a covert capability jump? The better those verification mechanisms are, the more predictable the playing field becomes. The weaker they are, the more incentive there is to test the edges. Finally, let's not miss the moral stakes embedded in the policy design. Public money comes from the public. Guardrails are, at minimum, a promise that support is tied to tangible domestic outcomes rather than headline announcements. Jobs, skills, capacity, and resilience that live where the taxpayer lives. At the same time, the tighter the lanes, the more centralized the decisions become about which technologies scale where and when. Individuals and smaller firms will feel that as forms to fill, approvals to wait for, and options that narrow. The intent is understandable. The execution must be honest, even when it is inconvenient. So think of industrial policy guardrails as more than fine print. They are part of the system's architecture. They aim to align private incentives with public goals without pretending the two are identical. When they are well calibrated, they steer billions of dollars and thousands of careers toward a coherent result. When they are vague, they invite confusion and creative interpretation. On this slide, that is the core lesson. Incentives are never neutral, and when you write them into law, they will decide more than any press conference ever could. Here is a simple truth that hides in plain sight. Even when the debate sounds political, the behavior on the factory floor is economic. Distance is a tax. Time is a tax. Variability is a tax. None of those show up on a ballot, but every one of them shows up in a monthly close. Start with distance. When a critical tool, part, or specialist has to travel farther, you do not just pay more for freight. You stretch the clock. Longer transit means higher inventory buffers, thicker safety stock, and more cash tied up in components that may or may not be needed this quarter. The cost of money is quiet, but it is relentless. And because modern semiconductor manufacturing depends on finely sequenced steps, a delay in one lane can idle very expensive equipment in another. That is the domino that accountants dread. Not a dramatic failure. A slow burn of underutilization that turns fixed costs into losses. Now add time. Lead times for specialized equipment and advanced packaging capacity do not shrink because we wish them to. They respond to order books, supplier bottlenecks, and learning curves. If a packaging line for high bandwidth memory is booked out, the whole system waits. You can have perfect wafers and still miss your delivery because the last mile of assembly is jammed. That queue is not political theater. It is physics and throughput. The lesson is that performance in this industry is the product of the slowest station, not the average of the fast ones. Learning curves magnify these effects. The more wafers you run, the more edge cases you discover, the sharper your playbook gets. A mature site does not just have better tools. It has better habits. Quicker diagnosis when a recipe drifts. Faster recovery when a pump fails. Shorter scrap runs when a mask shows subtle defects. Those tiny improvements compound. They are the reason a well-run fab pulls away even if a rival buys the same model of machine. So when supply chains are disrupted and volumes shift, you are not only moving hardware. You are resetting pieces of that hard-won accumulated knowledge. That costs speed. It costs yield. It costs patience. Let's talk about capital intensity, because the frontier keeps getting steeper. As extreme ultraviolet moves toward higher numerical aperture, the price of admission climbs. The cleanroom modules get heavier. The metrology gets more precise. The service contracts grow in scope because the parameter space to keep stable gets bigger. Advanced packaging adds another mountain range. Integrating memory stacks closely with compute, or stacking chiplets with hair-thin interconnects, converts what used to be an afterthought into a new bottleneck. If that packaging step is constrained by limited gear, limited substrate supply, or limited engineers who know how to keep the line humming, you feel it everywhere. Scheduling slips. Customer launches move. Revenue recognition slides a quarter to the right. Here is where misallocation bites. In a capital-intensive system, small errors in where you place capacity can produce large long-run gaps. Build packaging capacity that cannot support your logic roadmap, and you strand wafers. Build logic capacity without synchronized metrology and service support, and you cap your yield below what the spreadsheet assumed. Build perfectly, but scatter your sites so far apart that service teams spend their lives in airports, and you convert know-how into jet lag. The pattern is the same. The system punishes incoherence, quietly, via economics. Notice also how compliance overhead turns into cost even when everyone acts in good faith. If a service visit requires extra paperwork and scheduling, uptime drops a notch. If a spare module sits in a bonded warehouse waiting for a license code, a machine that could be printing value is now printing nothing. None of this requires anyone to break rules or make statements. It is the arithmetic of hours lost and cycles missed. That arithmetic is why companies invest so much in forecasting and buffer design. The more accurately you can see your constraints, the more gracefully you can route around them. There is a human rhythm under all of this. Teams build cadence. They trust a vendor who answers the phone at midnight. They know which lot to run when a piece of metrology is in maintenance. They know which engineer has the hands to fix a temperamental valve without triggering a day of drift. Disrupt the chain, and you disrupt that rhythm. The result is not collapse. It is drag. The machine still moves, but every motion costs more energy than it did last year. So why say not politics alone? Because whether a policy helps or hurts depends on how it lands inside this economic machinery. A rule that lines up with real choke points and gives industry a clear runway to adjust can reduce risk with manageable cost. A rule that ignores lead times, learning curves, and packaging queues can create friction that looks small on paper and enormous in practice. The same goes for private decisions. Announcing a shiny new toolset does not create coherence. Matching that toolset to service contracts, training programs, and nearby suppliers does. One more frame, and it is a useful one. Think of the supply chain as a river with tributaries. Policy can put levees along the banks. Markets decide where the water actually flows. If the levees are placed where the current is strongest, you can steer the river. If they are placed where the river was last decade, the water will simply find another path, and you will discover that the cost was paid without changing the outcome. That is why the best operators obsess over data. Not slogans, but cycle times, yields, queue depths, and supplier health. The takeaway from this slide is quiet but powerful. If you want to forecast where capability will grow and where it will stall, do not start with speeches. Start with calendars, distance charts, maintenance logs, and purchase orders for packaging substrates. That is where the future is already written, line by line, in costs and in learning. Politics sets the stage. Economics runs the show. Anytime you tighten the rules in a complex system, you do not just get the change you asked for. You also get side effects you did not order. Some are manageable. Some become the main plot. Let's map the big ones. First, fragmentation. When access to frontier tools, software, or services narrows, ecosystems begin to fork. You get parallel stacks, one aligned with the control coalition, another built around good enough substitutes. That parallelism is not just about hardware. It includes standards, file formats, training pipelines, and vendor relationships. At first, the fork looks slower and clunkier. Over time, it can become self-reinforcing. Universities teach to the tools they can access. Startups design to the parts they can buy. Procurement officers write specs that match their local reality. You wake up a few years later with two incompatible worlds that both work, just differently, and switching between them is expensive. Second, duplicated capacity. Controls aimed at choke points encourage targeted countries to build their own versions of the missing pieces. That duplication is rational from a security perspective, but it has an economic cost. Capital that could have gone to scaling proven lines or improving yields gets diverted into recreating basic infrastructure. The learning curve on the duplicate may be steeper and slower, which means more money goes into catching up rather than leaping ahead. Meanwhile, the original suppliers lose some scale efficiency because a portion of global demand peels away. Everyone pays the tax of redundancy, even if for different reasons. Third, shadow logistics. The tighter the gate, the more appealing the side door. Parts and subassemblies begin to move through longer and more convoluted routes. Middlemen appear with attractive explanations and tidy paperwork. Serial numbers get mixed in warehouses that sit just across policy boundaries. None of this requires cloak and dagger. It is spreadsheets looking for margin. The risk here is not only leakage of controlled capability. It is also loss of visibility. When components zigzag through layered intermediaries, even honest firms struggle to see where their products land. That degrades the feedback loop regulators rely on to calibrate rules. Fourth, disclosure opacity. When license decisions and service permissions become sensitive, firms adjust their reporting. Some details move from public filings to private conversations. Some country-level breakdowns get aggregated one layer higher. The stated reason is often competitive or legal prudence, and sometimes that is true. The effect, however, is that analysts, policymakers, and even supply chain partners see a foggier picture. Market signals blur. Are sales down because demand fell, because a license was denied, because a service permission changed, or because a customer delayed capex for unrelated reasons? Without clarity, planning turns into inference, and inference is the kind of friction that quietly raises costs. Fifth, capability mislabeling. When thresholds define what is controlled, incentives appear to rename or reclassify. A system that would normally be marketed as high performance becomes a research cluster. A tool configuration that is functionally close to the frontier is described as legacy plus. On paper, everyone stays inside the lines. In practice, the intent of the rule is harder to measure. This is not always malicious. Sometimes it is confusion. But in a regime that runs on definitions, fuzzy labels propagate uncertainty through the whole stack. Sixth, talent diversion. If servicing and support for certain sites becomes harder, some of the best field engineers spend more time on compliance, logistics, and travel workarounds than on process improvement. The opportunity cost is real. The same people who could be lifting yields or accelerating installs are busy threading needles. Meanwhile, constrained regions build their own training programs to reduce dependency. That is sensible, but it spreads scarce expertise thinner across more locations, slowing cumulative learning. Seventh, corridor gaming. When allied policies are similar but not identical, actors look for daylight. One jurisdiction processes licenses faster. Another defines a category slightly differently. A third has a longer grace period. The path of least resistance becomes a business model. If alignment later tightens, the corridor closes abruptly and leaves stranded inventories, half-finished installs, and unhappy customers. Those whiplash effects do not make headlines, but they feed the narrative that policy is unpredictable, which in turn discourages investment exactly where predictability is most valuable. Finally, the ethics of side effects. Controls are justified as risk management, and that goal matters. But side effects land on specific people. A graduate student who cannot get a measurement instrument. A small supplier who depended on service contracts that now require approvals they cannot navigate. A customer who built to one rule set and now must retrofit to another. If those costs are acknowledged and measured, the policy stays tethered to reality. If they are ignored, the system starts to look arbitrary from the ground up, and compliance turns into grudging theater rather than cooperative problem solving. So the watch list on this slide is not a prediction of doom. It is a checklist for vigilance. Fragmentation, duplication, shadow routing, opacity, mislabeling, talent diversion, corridor gaming, and human-level costs. If you see these rising, it is a sign to refine the dials. If you see them falling, it suggests the controls are landing closer to their design. Either way, the lesson is consistent. Complex systems answer our plans with their own behavior. Pay attention to the answers, especially the quiet ones. When we talk about export controls, lithography, or packaging queues, it is easy to forget that none of these things move on their own. People move them, which means the story is not just technical. It is moral, and it is organizational. Decisions made by specific humans, under constraints, add up to what we later call history. Let's make that concrete with a few quick vignettes. Picture a policymaker drafting a rule. They face two clocks. One clock says risk is rising fast, act now. The other clock says the economy absorbs change slowly, calibrate. Make the rule too narrow, and you miss the threat. Make it too broad, and you slow civilian progress that keeps everyone richer and, paradoxically, safer. The choice is not between good and bad. It is between imperfect options under uncertainty. The ethical move here is clarity. Say what the rule is trying to prevent, measure if it is working, and be willing to revise when the data tells a different story. Now picture a tool vendor deciding whether to pursue a license. The sales team sees revenue and jobs. The compliance team sees audits and reputational risk. The field service team sees customers who will be stranded if they cannot get a part. No one in that building is the villain. They are all trying to steward a capability that is genuinely useful in civilian life while acknowledging that the same capability can scale military power. The ethical hinge is honesty about trade-offs and the courage to walk away from a deal that clears the letter of the rule but violates its spirit. Third, a fab operator. They have a machine that is drifting off target. A service visit is possible, but the paperwork is heavy and the queue is long. They can keep running and scrap a percentage of lots, or they can pause and risk missing a delivery that a customer is counting on. If you have never managed a factory, this looks abstract. If you have, you know that these micro choices decide whether a capacity plan holds. The moral weight here is responsibility to people you will never meet. The engineers who rely on your chips. The patients whose devices depend on them. The students learning on systems you help power. Doing the right thing is sometimes the slower thing, and the slower thing is sometimes the safer system. Fourth, a designer at a startup. The latest tools are out of reach. They choose to build with what is available and invent around the constraint. Maybe they adopt model compression, or they architect their software so it is kinder to memory bandwidth. The ethical layer here is subtle. You are acting within the rules, but you are also proof that capability can route around choke points. Innovation is not neutral. It can lift ordinary life and it can lower the cost of power. Which is why system design matters, not just individual genius. These vignettes point to a simple pattern. Incentives shape behavior far more predictably than speeches do. Centralized rules can reduce risk by aiming at true bottlenecks. They can also invite rent-seeking if they are vague, and brittle workarounds if they are misaligned with reality on the ground. Decentralized experimentation can surface brilliant substitutions and healthier redundancy. It can also scatter accountability if no one owns the externalities. The sober path is to design institutions that reward truth-telling, penalize theater, and keep feedback loops short. What does that look like in practice? First, definitions that match how engineers actually build, not how we wish they built. Controls that target capabilities with clear harm pathways, rather than casting a fog over everything nearby. Second, transparency where possible. If a license is denied for a category, say why at the level that does not give away sensitive detail. The system functions better when honest actors can steer without guesswork. Third, humility about precision. Technology evolves. Thresholds that made sense last year may need updating, and that is not failure. It is maintenance of the system. There is also the matter of unintended power. When a few firms and a few governments sit at the hourglass neck, their choices ripple through lives far away. That is gravity, not malice. The ethical test is whether the people closest to the choke points act like stewards rather than owners. Stewardship sounds soft. It is not. It means refusing shortcuts that turn a safety rule into a marketing angle. It means treating end-use verification as a living practice rather than a file cabinet ritual. It means acknowledging when a rule lands harder than expected on civilian science and adjusting that landing without abandoning the security goal. Finally, remember individual dignity inside large systems. It is easy to draw maps with arrows and forget the technician who keeps a vacuum line stable at 3 in the morning, or the graduate student who loses 6 months because an instrument never arrived. Systems built only from the top down tend to miss those people. Systems that let evidence from the edges steer the center tend to learn faster and harm less. Agency is not just a philosophical word. It is a design input. Put it in early. So, the heart of this slide is not an argument for more control or less. It is a reminder that the outcomes we care about flow from the incentives we design and the character we demand from the people in high leverage roles. If we get those right, the technical brilliance compounds. If we get them wrong, even brilliant tools can leave us poorer, slower, and more brittle than we intended. Let's hold the past and the present side by side for a moment. Same table. 2 columns. On the left, CoCom. On the right, today's control coalitions. What carries over, and what changed so completely that using the old map can mislead you? Continuity first. CoCom taught that coalitions matter more than unilateral sermons. When the countries holding key capabilities align their lists, enforcement power multiplies. It also taught that definitions do the heavy lifting. If the list maps to real capabilities, controls bite. If the list is fuzzy, industry spends its energy decoding pros instead of aligning behavior. And it taught that enforcement is a practice, not an event. The moment a rule prints in ink is the moment the cat and mouse begins, so the machinery for updates has to be as routine as quarterly maintenance. Now the difference is, in the CoCom era, chokepoints existed, but they were broader and more interchangeable. Machine tools from several firms. Computers that were valuable, but not the entire nervous system of the global economy. Today's chokepoints are narrower and higher leverage. One company at EUV. A small triad in EDA. A few vendors in high-end metrology and advanced packaging lines. Flip one switch and capacity graphs bend for years. That concentration sharpens the effect of policy. It also raises the stakes of error. A small miscalibration now can echo far longer than it did then. Another difference is the role of the private sector. CoCom managed flows across borders in a world where national champions and state-led research set the pace. Today, private firms stitch together global supply chains at a density CoCom never had to reckon with. Design in one country, tools from a second, subsystems from a third, software teams spread across time zones. That means policy must land on contract terms, service agreements, and software keys, not just on crates at a port. It also means that tacit knowledge concentrated in vendor field teams is a strategic resource, not just a line item. Third difference. Speed. Scientific and engineering knowledge travels faster now, and compute scales softer bottlenecks faster than bureaucracies can rewrite definitions. A white paper today can be a code repository tomorrow and a product demo next quarter. In that environment, performance thresholds age quickly. The feedback loop between rule and workaround is shorter, which means calibration cycles must tighten or the regime lags reality and loses trust. Fourth, the center of gravity in technology itself. In the CoCom era, the most sensitive items were often single systems you could count and track. Today, capability emerges from networks and stacks. Clusters of accelerators. Software frameworks. Packaging that couples memory and logic into one behaving unit. If you aim at the wrong layer, the system routes around you. Aim too broadly and you throttle civilian spillovers you didn't intend to touch. The lesson is not do nothing or do everything, it is precision. Target real bottlenecks with rules that map to how capability actually accumulates now. Fifth, transparency norms. CoCom was a club with quiet rules. Today's environment expects more public rationale and more standardized lists, yet commercial confidentiality and national security carve out large gray zones. The balance is delicate. Too little transparency and legitimate actors cannot steer. Too much, and you hand adversaries a blueprint for dancing at the margins. The practical test is whether honest firms can infer the intent and plan roadmaps without hiring a fortune teller. What does all this add up to? The old lessons endure, but the levers are tighter, faster, and more entangled with private ecosystems. Coalitions still matter, perhaps more than ever. Lists still matter, but they must be engineered with the same care as the machines they govern. Enforcement still matters, but now it includes service contracts, software updates, and the knowledge that lives in the heads of 3 field engineers who know which gasket fails in week 7. So the clean takeaway of this slide is a pair of questions. Are we learning the right lessons from CoCom, or just repeating the parts that are narratively satisfying? And are we updating the parts that the new world demands we update? If we can keep the discipline of coalition and precision while adapting to narrower choke points, faster cycles, and deeper private sector wiring, controls can be both sharper and less blunt at the same time. If we cannot, we will discover that the name on the regime changed, but the world underneath did not. We have walked from Cold War committees to modern control stacks, from alliance alignment to the hourglass where a single machine, a single software stack, and a handful of people can tilt outcomes for years. So what do we actually carry out of the room? First, precision beats posture. Controls work best when they map to real bottlenecks, not to vibes. Aim at the narrow necks where capability concentrates, measure what changes on factory floors, and be ready to revise. When definitions track how engineers actually build, the rules shape behavior before anyone even thinks about evasion. Second, coalitions are multipliers. A lone gate can slow a car. Coordinated gates can reroute a highway. Alignment among the holders of lithography, design software, metrology, and advanced packaging matters more than any press release. When the switches are flipped together, incentives change everywhere at once. Third, time and learning do quiet math. Lead times, service queues, and packaging capacity can decide more than headlines. A slightly longer wait for a module, a slightly slower service visit, a slightly foggier license outcome, these accumulate into real gaps. If a policy does not account for that arithmetic, it pays costs without buying much security. Fourth, watch the unintended. Fragmentation, duplicated capacity, shadow routing, disclosure fog, talent diversion, these are not side notes. They are signals that calibration needs work. If the side effects grow faster than the intended effects, the system is whispering that something is off. Fifth, keep agency in the loop. Rules are written by people and implemented by people. The technician watching a vacuum seal at 3 in the morning. The designer shaving millimeters off a mask shape to make a recipe printable. The policy analyst updating a threshold so it matches reality instead of last year's model. If the system listens to those edges, it learns. If it doesn't, it drifts. So here is the checklist I want you to leave with. Be narrow where leverage is high. Be transparent enough for honest actors to plan. Be humble enough to update without drama. And be honest about costs that land on civilian science and small firms, because legitimacy is also a bottleneck. Now the open questions for you to chew on after this video. Which mix of centralized guardrails and decentralized experimentation best preserves security while compounding innovation? Where are today's definitions already lagging practice? And how do we measure success in years, not news cycles, so we know whether the river of capability has truly been steered or has simply found a new channel? If this sparked new ways of seeing the story behind the chip debate, I would love to hear your take. Do you think the current approach is calibrated, or are we repeating old patterns with sharper tools? Before we go, a quick ask that really helps this channel reach more curious minds. If you enjoyed this, like the video, drop a comment with your biggest takeaway or question, and subscribe for more deep dives that connect history, technology, and the incentives shaping our world. And if you want to go deeper into lost stories and uncomfortable truths, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. You will find the link in the description. If you like thoughtful, entertaining history with rigor and personality, you are in the right place. See you in the next one.